Hello and welcome back. I've read the posts on William Sanders at Tin Wolf Lake and Howard Waldrop's The Ugly Chickens, and I thought I would add my own reading of one of those texts into the discussion to help us think about these issues, about how indigeneity can operate outside of humanity. So I would want to read a presentation that I'm going to give at the Popular Culture Association conference in February. Grace Dillon will actually be there, so I'll be able to throw some of those ideas I'm quoting from her back and see if she agrees with me, so I think it'll be interesting. So the presentation title I call The Future of First Beings, and I start with a little bit of background on Sanders, which you guys should already pretty much know and be able to appreciate, right, because you've already read quite a few Sanders texts already. And then I get into my specific argument using at Tin Wolf Lake. So here we go, the future of first beings. In his collection of short stories, East of the Sun and West of Fort Smith, William Sundown Sanders explains that he excludes a few stories that he had previously published from his anthology. He refers twice to not having a literary biographer, which he argues would be the only person interested in a complete works. With his characteristic dark humor, Sanders writes that an anthology inclusive of any author's entire writings is not to be expected unless he or she is at ambient temperature. Charles DeLint admits in his review of The Ballad of Billy Badass and the Rose of Turkestan that he thought Sanders was a promising new author and was dumbfounded when he discovered that he had published 16 books. Sanders has been a top contender for the Nebula, Hugo, and Campbell Awards. He won the Sideways Award for Alternate History with the short story The Undiscovered, about William Shakespeare as a captive in an old Cherokee village, rewriting Hamlet for the tribe. He won the Sideways Award again for his short story Empire. Sanders edited the online SF journal Helix from 2006 to 2008, leaving in a manner that stirred up a significant amount of online controversy. Despite all of this, he has received very little critical attention, besides short, surface-level reviews of his work and a few brief mentions in Daniel Heath Justice's History of Cherokee Literature. Sanders' work, however, is starting to receive more critical attention. In her recent anthology, Walking the Clouds, Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon collects short stories and excerpts from longer works of indigenous science fiction by many Native authors. She begins each of these with a short critical introduction, tying each story to Native theory, other science fiction, and similar genres, such as Afrofuturism, tying those to indigenous science fiction. She includes William Sanders' When This World Is All on Fire as an example of the subgenre Native Apocalypse. The story is about a post-catastrophe world which is struggling for land after a cataclysmic flood. The protagonist, Jimmy Lonekiller, attempts to prevent a family of squatters from encroaching on the land of the Eastern Band Cherokees. In the introduction to a previous anthology, Hive of Dreams, Contemporary Science Fiction from the Pacific Northwest, Dillon explains, quote, "It is widely noted that science fiction is one of the contemporary genres that most clearly confronts environmental issues and human and non-human nature," end quote. When This World Is All on Fire, as Dillon points out, is clearly concerned with the inevitabilities of what happens when we are unable to confront environmental issues. Another short story by Sanders, which is not in Dillon's collection, At Tin Wolf Lake, clearly confronts issues about human and non-human nature. What Dillon sees as strong themes in science fiction are also prevalent in indigenous science fiction. And this last theme, that of the non-human, has consumed my energies for the last few years and has led me to explore what I call the study of first beings. I want to briefly summarize my work here before I get into a reading of At Tin Wolf Lake. Put succinctly, the study of first beings is a line of inquiry concerned with how we, as indigenous peoples, narrate our relationships with other species. And I am indebted to Linda Hogan's First People for my work on this. And I am putting forth a special issue of Studies in American Indian Literatures on the topic. It's currently under review. I've also written an article that looks at how we narrate animals in political discourse, native political discourse, which is also under review with a journal. And in it, I argue that two current native political theorists, Tyche Alford and Del Turner, should go further in thinking about relationships with other species, and that this further contemplation is needed to rigorously theorize our own concepts of sovereignty. This article is titled The Sovereignty of First Beings. But Sanders' work is more than just interesting science fiction for me to read and using this theoretical lens of first beings. It was influential on how I rethought Hogan's use of the term first people. Last year, one of the conference for Native American Literature Symposium respondents, Gwen Westerman, taught me that in Dakota the word for a group of animals translates directly to people. And this may be similar in many native languages. I've gotten mixed responses from my inquiry into whether this is the same in the Cherokee language, but I have seen references to animal nations by Cherokee poets. Painter Merv Jacobs says that animals are, quote, people too to the Cherokees, end quote. And Christine Armour, who teaches and has taught me Cherokee at the University of Oklahoma, says that this isn't the case linguistically. So perhaps there are just too many Cherokees to agree on anything, and this might have been the problem with the last tribal election. But my rationale for changing people to beings was where I'm going to lead this inquiry. So by doing a close reading of At Tinwolf Lake, for this justification of why I say we should talk about animals as first beings rather than the first people, like much native discourse does. So a strong reading of At Tinwolf Lake as racial allegory that plays with the definitions of and dynamics between mixed blood and full blood is called for. The story is told in first person by the narrator, Jack Moss. He is a pilot of a small commuter plane, which is used to transport cargo or people on short trips. And according to the interview with Sanders, he wanted to be a pilot as a child, although he never became one. And his research on flying aircraft is evident in the amount of technical detail he adds to his story to describe takeoffs and landings. He mentions with pride that a few real pilots asked him if he was writing from his own experience. And in the note after the story, Sanders explains that he came up with the idea for it while playing one of his many computer flight simulators. Now, I'm not spoiling anything for you guys because you've already hopefully read this story, but as you know, the reader is unaware that the pilot looks like a Sasquatch until almost 3 full pages into the narrative. But a second read could provide a lot of clues which foreshadow this, such as the fact that he was too big for the plane's cockpit, and that if he could land another job with a larger plane, then his current employer could, quote, kiss his large hairy ass, end quote. We do not realize the condition until one of the passengers reacts to him in a very inappropriate manner. And while I use the term Sasquatch to describe the pilot, that's not quite accurate per the story. Sasquatch is another group of beings. And when asked about speaking in Sasquatch, Jack tells the passengers he cannot speak it at all, but he does speak Arulutag. When the passenger seems incredulous about this, Jack asks, "How's your Arabic?" To which the passenger replies, "Point taken." Jack explains to another passenger's inquiries that the term hominid American is too politically correct and awkward. Instead, most people like him prefer the terms homin or hom. And this directly echoes issues surrounding the terms Native American Indian or American Indian. The passage where Jack visits an unfamiliar bar provides Sanders' most vivid depictions of speciesism standing in for racism. Jack is tired from a long day of flying passengers and cargo and is looking for a meal and a drink. Before he is able to sit on the bar stool, the barkeep barks that he isn't allowed to in the place and directs him to the sign that reads, "No monkeys, no Indians, dogs welcome." In this misspelling of the word monkey, which has been used as a racial epithet in other cases, right, connotes the barkeep's intellectual as well as social and ethical ignorance. The bartender chases the bewildered Jack out of the door at gunpoint, telling him that, quote, "The Supreme Court says you're people," end quote, but he doesn't have to cater to, quote, "damn dirty apes." And Sanders here is obviously alluding to the Charlton Heston's famous line in Planet of the Apes. In a state of shock the episode leaves him in, Jack thinks about reporting the barkeep to the Hominids Rights Watch. And it also leads him to reflect on the changes in attitudes towards speciesism, which provides us as readers a good exposition of the politics of the world Sanders has created. And Jack was so surprised that the bartender, because of his words, acts of overt speciesism were, quote, "were getting increasingly rare." Jack, however, doesn't paint a picture of unproblematic increasing tolerance. He does refer to more concealed types of discrimination, such as restaurants requiring shoes, which Homs don't wear. In this passage, speciesism apparently stands in for racism, with the bigoted signs and violent denial of service. And I won't go further in exploring this racial allegory, not only to avoid, well, you've already read it, so I'm not spoiling it, but for the people I'm reading at the conference, I might be spoiling it, but to stick to my point about how speciesism operates in the story. So the reading of At Tin Wolf Lake as racial allegory is a strong reading, but it isn't, of course, the only reading. One of the reasons we have for reading this as more than racial allegory is that we have Indian characters in the story as well. Right? An Inuit man, Miles, who works with Jack, is shown to us in the beginning of the story. Jack meets up with a more militant Hom relation named Charlie, who rejects that label altogether, arguing that the term hominid equates to second-rate human. And here Sanders is providing a further complication on the theme of properly naming. Charlie belongs to the Radical Hominid Power Organization. And Jimmy, Jack speculates, is probably from War Party, which is a similar radical Indian movement. And they both have shown up to ask Jack to fly something illegal, and Jack declines. The bumper sticker on their truck, however, is really interesting. It reads, quote, "First Beings Power," end quote, with a hairy fist beside it. And Sanders is clearly satirizing militant animal rights and native rights groups. But he doesn't necessarily privilege Jack's approach. After being forced out of the bar, Jack takes his frustration out by punching a tree repeatedly until his knuckles are bloody and full of splinters. He thinks that he would report the barkeep to Hominids Rights Watch because, quote, "they make a lot more trouble for him than I could." There was some satisfaction in that thought. But we don't see a more productive path in the story for combating these types of injustice, which I argue can be seen as racist and speciesist. Now, this all begs the question of why I decided to use the term first beings, a term promoted on the bumper sticker of a militant activist group that Jack opposes and that Sanders characterizes as troublemakers. And my reason for this is the group that actively supports social justice, such as the fictionalized Hominid Rights Watch, are not formed solely by patient benevolence, although this is helpful in forming and sustaining such groups. Strong language about interspecies activism is needed to shift discourse in the direction of these issues before groups form and struggle to maintain a more ethical standard. Excuse me here. So in choosing the term beings over people, I'm attempting to make a little trouble insofar as it persuades those in a discourse, specifically native political theorists, to incorporate other than human beings more rigorously into their formulations of sovereignty, and to persuade others to search the archives of native literatures for text where this is already being narrated. And I'm no idealist. I understand the danger of terminal creeds, which Visner so tirely warns us against. Terminal creeds is Visner's word for ideology, when someone has an idea that they stick to stringently and they don't want to question it. In the future, I'll be happy to acknowledge that native political theory has recognized other species as people, but for now, at least from the theorists I have read, I don't see that as accurate. Another character at the end of At Tin Wolf Lake says, and this is one of the character that turns, the man who turns, and one of the people who are turn into a werewolf, says that to, quote, come out as a people is going to take time and organization and hard work, end quote. And I see the way I write about the study of first beings as near as early stages of that work. Indigenous science fiction is also, I believe, a very useful genre to help me carry this out. So thank you for indulging me in listening to this presentation that I'm going to give. And I know I use some words and concepts that might be not very familiar, but hopefully you were still able to get some interesting ideas about the story off of this reading. So for next time, I want you guys to, we're going to start Robopocalypse. We're going to read the first section, the prelude, and section 1, which is titled, what is it titled? Isolated Incidents. And right, this is about 90 pages, so, but it reads very quickly because it's a novel here, so we're not reading some of like criticism or something like that, and it should go pretty quickly. But I've also purposely put it at the beginning of a weekend so that you'll have time to read ahead if you find that you're having a hard time getting through these sections. We're going to read about a section every day, and so you want to thumb through there and kind of get a feel for how much reading is involved in this last stretch of class. And for our assignment, I'm going to open it up to a discussion board post and let you guys post whatever you feel is interesting. Just make sure to give me a substantial post, and like always, pay close attention to details. Maybe pick a particular passage and explain that. And then, as always, make sure that you do respond to 2 other posts to be able to receive full credit. All right, I thank you for your patience on this extra long video, and I will see you all next time.